this one, I've been kind of wrestling with this all week, and I'm fascinated and a little bit disturbed. So we're going to be taking a deep dive into the work of Thomas Ligotti.
Yes.
Specifically his book, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race.
Right.
This book is a deep exploration of philosophical pessimism.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, it's not for the faint of heart.
Yeah. Ligotti's, it's compelling work because he doesn't shy away from, like, the hard questions.
Yeah.
You know, he really confronts the potential downsides of consciousness.
Right.
And that can be very unsettling.
It definitely was for me.
Yeah.
One of the first things that really struck me was his concept of psychogenesis.
Yeah.
Essentially, he's arguing that the emergence of self-awareness in humans was a kind of evolutionary wrong turn.
Yeah, and what makes it so fascinating is this idea that, like, the thing that makes us better than animals is actually the root of all of our, like, existential angst.
So you're saying self-awareness, the thing that makes us human, is also the source of our biggest existential problem.
That's exactly what he's arguing.
Okay.
He suggests that before psychogenesis, humans, like other animals, existed in a state of, like, blissful ignorance.
Yes.
Death was just a natural part of life. Not something to be feared or contemplated.
Like ignorance is bliss.
Yeah.
Which goes against everything we're taught to value about, like, knowledge and understanding.
Right. He really challenges those assumptions.
Yeah.
And asks us to consider whether consciousness, with all of its burdens and anxieties, is truly a blessing or a curse.
It's a heavy question, and one that I'm still grappling with.
Yeah.
But let's dive a little deeper into this idea of psychogenesis.
Okay.
Ligotti uses this analogy in the book that really stuck with me.
Okay.
He asks us to imagine ourselves as pre-self-aware beings, just living moment to moment, driven by instinct and basic needs. And then suddenly we wake up to the reality of our own existence, our separateness from the world, and most terrifying of all, the inevitability of death.
It's like we're all thrust into this cosmic joke where we're the only ones that get the punchline.
Yeah.
And it's not a very funny one.
And that sense of cosmic absurdity runs throughout Ligotti's work.
Totally.
So if self-awareness is the problem, does Ligotti offer any solutions? Or are we just doomed to suffer?
Well, he doesn't sugarcoat things. He's a pessimist through and through.
Yeah.
But he does explore some potential paths to alleviating suffering, although they're not exactly what you'd call conventional.
Let's hear them. I'm curious to see where he goes with this.
One of the ideas he explores is ego death.
Okay.
The complete dissolution of the self.
Okay.
He suggests that by letting go of the illusion of a separate, we can potentially escape the cycle of suffering that is tied to our individual ego.
Ego death, that sounds pretty intense.
Yeah.
Is he suggesting we all need to become enlightened monks or something?
Not necessarily. He draws from the experiences of figures like Yuji Krishnamurti, who reportedly experienced ego death and described it as a state of liberation from the illusion of self.
Okay.
But he also acknowledges that this path is fraught with challenges.
What kind of challenges?
Well, if we completely dissolve our sense of self, what happens to our relationships and responsibilities, our place in the world?
Right.
Ligotti doesn't provide easy answers.
Yeah.
He's more interested in raising these difficult questions and forcing us to confront the complexities of our own existence.
It's definitely making me question some assumptions that I've always held about what it means to be human.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got psychogenesis as the root of the problem.
Right.
Ego death as one potential, albeit challenging solution. What else does Ligotti explore in his critique of the human condition?
Another key point he makes is that societal progress doesn't actually solve the fundamental problem of suffering. He argues that even with advancements in technology, medicine, and social structures, we're still subject to the same existential anxieties, the same fears and uncertainties that have plagued humanity since the dawn of consciousness.
So all those utopian visions of a future where technology solves all our problems and we live in perfect harmony. Ligotti would say, that's just wishful thinking.
Exactly. He believes that suffering is an inherent part of the human condition, regardless of external circumstances.
I can see how that could be a discouraging thought.
Yeah.
If even progress can't save us, are we just stuck in this perpetual cycle of suffering?
Ligotti seems to think so, at least to some extent.
Okay.
But he doesn't just leave us wallowing in despair. He also explores how we cope with this reality.
Okay.
The psychological mechanisms we use to manage the terror of our own mortality.
Right.
And the inherent meaninglessness he sees in life.
Like those defense mechanisms you mentioned earlier.
Yes.
I'm really intrigued by that idea.
Yes. He identifies several key strategies, such as isolation, anchoring, distraction, and even sublimation. These are all ways of creating a buffer between ourselves and the harsh realities of existence.
Let's unpack those defense mechanisms.
Yeah.
I have a feeling this is where things start to get really interesting.
Absolutely. But before we delve into those, let's take a moment to consider one of the most controversial aspects of Ligotti's work.
Okay.
His views on suicide.
Okay.
Yeah. Definitely a sensitive subject.
Right. And I think it's important to approach this carefully. You mentioned he's not advocating for suicide,
Right.
but rather exploring it as a philosophical concept, right?
Exactly. Ligotti argues that suicide, when viewed through his lens of philosophical pessimism, can be seen as a logical response to the inherent suffering he believes is built into human existence.
So for someone who views life as inherently tragic, ending that suffering might seem like a rational choice.
That's the argument that he's making. Well, it's important to remember he's not endorsing or encouraging suicide in any way.
Right. Of course, he's simply exploring it as a philosophical concept.
Right.
Within the context of his broader worldview.
That makes sense. It's about understanding his perspective,
Right.
not necessarily agreeing with it.
Right.
So how does this tie into the defense mechanisms we were about to discuss?
He argues that these coping strategies are, in a way, subtle forms of suicide.
Oh, wow.
Not a physical ending, but a kind of psychic suicide, where we numb ourselves to the full weight of conscious existence.
Wow, that's a provocative thought. You're saying that things that we generally consider healthy, like finding distractions or seeking comfort in beliefs, are actually forms of self-annihilation.
That's how he sees it.
Wow.
Let's take isolation as an example. He argues that we often mentally distance ourselves from the suffering of others, creating a psychological barrier that protects us from fully confronting the harsh realities of the world.
I can see that. It's like we build these walls around ourselves thinking, that could never happen to me. Precisely. And while this might offer temporary comfort, it also prevents us from developing true empathy and compassion.
Yeah.
It's a form of shutting down, of closing ourselves off from the full spectrum of human experience.
Okay, so isolation is a form of psychic suicide.
Yes.
What about the other mechanisms? Let's talk about anchoring.
He describes anchoring as the process of clinging to beliefs, ideologies, or rituals that provide a sense of stability and meaning in a world that he sees as inherently chaotic and meaningless.
So things like religion, political affiliations, even our sense of identity can act as anchors.
Exactly. They offer a sense of security, a framework for understanding our place in the universe.
But Ligotti views this as another form of self-deception.
Right. He argues that while these anchors may provide temporary comfort, they're ultimately illusions. They're constructs we create to shield ourselves from the reality that life might have no inherent meaning or purpose.
It's starting to feel like any way we try to make sense of existence is just another form of running away from the truth, according to Ligotti.
Right.
What about distraction?
Yeah.
That seems like a pretty common way to cope with difficult emotions.
He argues that our modern world is a masterclass in distraction. We're constantly bombarded with information, entertainment, and endless opportunities for sensory overload.
I know. I'm definitely guilty of that. Scrolling through social media, binging shows, anything to avoid boredom or facing uncomfortable thoughts.
Ligotti would say that's exactly the point.
Right.
These distractions, while seemingly harmless, keep us from confronting the deeper questions about life, death, and our place in the universe. They prevent us from truly engaging with our own existence.
Okay, so we've got isolation, anchoring, and distraction, all acting as subtle forms of psychic suicide.
Yes.
What about sublimation? You mentioned that one earlier, and it seemed a bit more complex.
Sublimation for Ligotti is the process of channeling our darker impulses, anxieties and fears into creative or productive outlets. Think of artists, writers, musicians who explore themes of suffering, death, and the human condition in their work.
So it's like taking all that existential dread and transforming it into something beautiful or meaningful.
Exactly. And Ligotti sees this as perhaps the most effective defense mechanism because it allows us to engage with the darkness without being completely consumed by it.
He even mentions his own writing as a form of sublimation, right?
He does. He acknowledges that writing The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, a book that delves deeply into his pessimistic philosophy, was a way for him to confront and process his own anxieties about the nature of existence.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like he's taking all that darkness and shaping it into something that, while unsettling, can also be profound and thought-provoking.
Right, and while he sees these defense mechanisms as ultimately futile attempts to reconcile ourselves to a reality that he views as fundamentally hostile to our well-being,
right,
he recognizes their necessity.
So we're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
We need these coping mechanisms to function, but they're also preventing us from fully experiencing life.
That seems to be the paradox of the human condition, according to Ligotti.
Right.
But he does offer a glimmer of hope, or at least a different way of looking at things, through the concept of the unperson. The unperson.
This is the first time I'm hearing about this.
Okay.
Tell me more.
Ligotti describes unpersons as individuals who, for various reasons, have been stripped of their social status, their identity, their sense of self. They exist outside the norms and expectations of society.
So are we talking about people who are literally ostracized or living on the fringes of society?
It can manifest in that way, but it's more about a psychological state.
Okay.
He draws parallels to people experiencing severe depression.
Okay.
Those who've lost their sense of purpose and connection to the world.
So it's a kind of detachment from the things most people value: success.
Yeah.
Relationships.
Yeah.
Societal recognition.
Exactly. And while this might seem like a bleak existence,
right,
Ligotti suggests that unpersonhood can also be a form of liberation.
Liberation. But how can being stripped of your identity and purpose be liberating?
Ligotti argues that unpersons are free from the illusions that trap most people in a cycle of striving and dissatisfaction. They're no longer bound by the expectations and pressures of society.
I'm trying to wrap my head around this. It's like he's saying that by losing everything, we gain a kind of freedom.
In a way, yes, it's a radical idea, and certainly not one that everyone would embrace.
Right.
But it challenges us to question what we truly value, and whether those values are serving us or keeping us trapped in a system that ultimately leads to suffering.
This is all so incredibly thought-provoking. We've gone from the potential downsides of self-awareness to coping mechanisms that act as subtle suicides.
Right.
And now this idea of finding liberation in unpersonhood, I'm sensing a theme of confronting the darkness, of peeling back the layers of illusion to see the world as Ligotti sees it.
You're spot on. And this leads us into the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore how Ligotti connects these ideas about consciousness, suffering, and the human condition to the realm of the supernatural.
I'm ready to keep exploring.
All right.
Let's do it.
Okay. So we're talking about this idea of a sense of the supernatural.
Right.
And how it kind of plays into Ligotti's work.
Yeah. How does he differentiate between like a belief in the supernatural and this sense of it?
So he's not advocating for blind faith or superstition.
Right.
He sees those as like crutches, another form of anchoring ourselves to comforting illusions. But he proposes a different way of engaging with the idea of the supernatural. Through a sense of the supernatural.
A sense of the supernatural.
Yeah.
What exactly does that mean?
So he suggests that this sense arises from our consciousness, from our very awareness of our own mortality, and the fragility of life. It's that feeling of unease, that awareness that there might be forces at play beyond our comprehension.
It reminds me of those moments when you feel a chill down your spine for no apparent reason.
Right.
Or when you catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of your eye.
Yes.
And it's gone before you can fully register it.
Exactly. Those fleeting moments of unease, that sense that something should not be. That's what he's talking about.
Correct.
He argues that it's a natural byproduct of our evolved brain, our capacity to question and contemplate our existence.
So it's not about believing in ghosts or demons, but more about acknowledging that there are aspects of reality, of consciousness itself that we may never fully understand.
Precisely. And this is where Ligotti's love of horror comes into play. He sees horror as a genre that taps into this primal sense of the supernatural, this awareness of the unknown that lurks beneath the surface of our everyday lives.
You mentioned earlier that Ligotti sees horror as a kind of healthy response to the human condition. Can you elaborate on that?
So he believes that good horror doesn't rely on cheap scares or gore.
Right.
It creates an atmosphere, a mood, that evokes a sense of dread, a cosmic unease that forces us to confront those things we'd rather ignore. The fragility of our bodies, the darkness in our own hearts, the vastness of the universe, and our insignificant place within it.
It's like I'm starting to understand why he draws a distinction between belief in the supernatural and a sense of the supernatural.
Right.
Belief can be comforting, but it can also be limiting.
Right.
It provides answers even if those answers are ultimately illusions.
Yeah.
A sense of the supernatural, on the other hand, keeps us open to the mystery of the unknown.
Exactly. Ligotti isn't interested in providing answers. He's more interested in asking questions and pushing the boundaries of our understanding, in exploring the dark corners of human consciousness and the universe itself.
So how does this all connect back to his overall philosophy of pessimism? If horror allows us to confront the darkness, does he see that as a path to overcoming that darkness?
I wouldn't say that he sees it as a path to overcoming the darkness. He's a pessimist, remember?
Right.
He believes that suffering and disillusionment are inherent to the human condition.
Yeah.
But he does see horror as a way of acknowledging that darkness, of accepting it as an integral part of existence.
It's like that old saying, the only way out is through. We can't ignore the darkness, the anxieties, the existential dread that comes with being human.
Right.
We have to confront it head on.
And horror for Ligotti provides a safe space to do that.
Right.
It allows us to explore those dark themes, to engage with the unsettling and the unknown without being completely overwhelmed by them.
This has been an incredible journey, to say the least. We've gone from questioning the very nature of consciousness to exploring the depths of human psychology, and now we've arrived at this fascinating intersection of philosophy, horror, and the supernatural. I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on things.
Ligotti's work is challenging, thought-provoking, and ultimately deeply human.
Right.
Even in his pessimism, there's a kind of honesty, a refusal to shy away from the hard truths about existence that I find both unsettling and strangely comforting.
I completely agree. So for our listeners who are now intrigued by Ligotti's unique worldview, where do we recommend they start?
The Conspiracy Against the Human Race is definitely his most well-known work and the one we've focused on today. But he's also written numerous short stories that explore similar themes, often with a blend of horror, dark humor, and philosophical depth.
And if our listeners want to delve even deeper into these ideas of pessimism and horror, are there any other authors or thinkers you'd recommend?
Ligotti himself was heavily influenced by writers like H.P. Lovecraft, Edgar Allan Poe, and Arthur Schopenhauer. Those are all great starting points for exploring the literary tradition that Ligotti draws from.
I've always been fascinated by Lovecraft's cosmic horror.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a natural connection there with Ligotti's ideas about the vastness and indifference of the universe.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those interested in the philosophical side of things, exploring the works of existentialist thinkers like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre can provide further context for understanding Ligotti's worldview.
This has been a truly mind-bending deep dive. Thank you for guiding us through the intricate and often unsettling world of Thomas Ligotti.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listeners, remember, even in the face of the abyss, there's always something new to discover, something to ponder, something to keep us diving deeper into the mysteries of existence.
So we've talked about psychogenesis as this kind of like root of the problem.
Right.
We talked about these defense mechanisms.
Yeah.
We've even talked about unpersonhood as a potential path to like freedom from suffering.
Yeah.
Where does Ligotti go from there?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. He starts to connect these ideas about consciousness and suffering to the realm of the supernatural.
Okay, so this is where we go full-blown spooky then.
Not exactly. Remember, Ligotti isn't advocating for blind faith or superstition. He sees those as crutches. You know, just another way to kind of like anchor ourselves to comforting illusions.
Right.
But he proposes this different way of engaging with the supernatural. He calls it a sense of the supernatural.
A sense of the supernatural? What does that even mean?
It's like this feeling of unease, you know? Like a kind of deep down awareness that there might be forces at play beyond our comprehension.
So like when you get the chills for no reason?
Exactly. Or when you see something out of the corner of your eye and it's gone before you can really make it out.
Yeah. Or like that feeling of being watched when you know you're alone.
Yeah. It's like that primal instinct that tells us we're not alone in the universe, even if our rational minds tell us otherwise.
So it's not about believing in ghosts or demons.
No.
It's more like acknowledging that there are things we just can't explain.
Right. And that's where I think Ligotti's love of horror really comes in.
Right.
Because for him, horror isn't about cheap scares. It's about tapping into that sense of dread, that cosmic unease.
It's about atmosphere.
Exactly. It's about creating a mood that forces us to confront the things we usually try to ignore.
Like our own mortality.
Yeah, or the darkness that exists in all of us.
It's interesting, though, because he seems to draw this clear line between belief in the supernatural and a sense of the supernatural.
Yeah.
Like he's saying that belief can be comforting,
Uh-huh.
but it can also kind of box us in.
Yeah, it closes us off to other possibilities.
Because it gives us easy answers.
Right, even if those answers are ultimately just illusions.
Whereas a sense of the supernatural keeps us open to the mystery.
Yeah, it keeps us questioning.
Keeps us searching.
Exactly. And that's really at the heart of Ligotti's work. He's not trying to give us all the answers. He's more interested in asking the difficult questions.
So, with all of this talk about horror and the supernatural, how does it tie back to his overall philosophy of pessimism?
Well, I wouldn't say that he sees horror as a way to overcome the darkness, because ultimately he does believe that suffering and disillusionment are just a part of life. But he does see it as a way to acknowledge that darkness.
Okay.
To accept it as a fundamental part of existence.
It's kind of like ripping off the Band-Aid.
Yeah.
Like you can't ignore the darkness, you have to confront it.
And horror gives us a way to do that safely. It lets us explore those dark thoughts and feelings without being completely consumed by them.
This has been quite a journey, I have to say. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
From the nature of consciousness to coping mechanisms to even like the idea of finding freedom and unpersonhood. And now we're talking about horror and the supernatural.
Yeah.
I feel like I need to go lie down in a dark room and process all of this.
Well, maybe not a dark room, but I totally get it. It's heavy stuff.
It is, but it's also incredibly thought-provoking. And I have to say, even though Ligotti's a pessimist, there's something kind of refreshing about his honesty. Like, he's not trying to sugarcoat anything.
Exactly. He's just laying it all out there.
And I think that's why his work resonates with so many people, even if it makes them a little uncomfortable.
Because deep down, we all know that life isn't always sunshine and rainbows.
Right.
There's darkness, too.
And sometimes confronting that darkness
Yeah.
can be a way to find a deeper understanding of ourselves.
Exactly. And I think that's ultimately what Ligotti's trying to do. With his writing, with his philosophy, he's trying to make us face the abyss and see what stares back.
Well, on that note, I think we'll leave our listeners to ponder that thought. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Thomas Ligotti. It's been a truly mind-bending experience.
It has. And to our listeners, if this has sparked your curiosity, I highly recommend checking out Ligotti's work for yourselves. It's not always easy reading, but it will definitely make you think.
And if you're looking to explore similar themes and other authors, we've mentioned a few along the way, like Lovecraft and Poe, but there's a whole world of dark and fascinating literature out there, just waiting to be discovered.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deeper into the mysteries of existence.